Get ready, Cincinnati, because here's the show that's got the town's toes a-tapping. Gotta dance! And here's your host, our own afternoon consulting physician, the man himself, Dr. Johnny Fever!
Listen up, fellow babies. It's time once again for Hold My Order Terrible Dresser, the deep dive history nerd WKRP in Cincinnati podcast. I am the upstanding Apollonian dad rock loving Dr. Rob McDougall, and with me is my ravenous Dionysian yacht rock loving id, Mr. Mike Grasso. How's it going, Mike?
How's it going, baby? My best Riptide impression.
And that is because today we are, we're watching a sui generis episode of WKRP. I hope I pronounced that right. The amazing Dr. Fever and Mr. Tide.
What a wonderful episode for us to be doing a couple weeks before Halloween. And also a wonderful episode to have our first return guest host, Rob.
Woo, yes, that's right. Let's give a warm welcome back to our really good friend and a really good guest, Mr. Jeff Wikstrom.
Thank you. Oh, that's okay. You don't have to do that. Thank you. Thank you, though. Thank you.
Yeah, you can't see what we were doing, but we were either doing hosannas and sort of bowing up and down Wayne and Garth style, or giving him a round of applause. You can't hear it though, so
we'll sweeten the applause. We'll dub that in a little bit. We'll sweeten a big
yes.
woo from the audience, which they're not supposed to do on a MTM show, but sometimes the audience can't help itself.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Jeff, of course, was with us way back in the first season of Hold My Order.
The pre-iTunes days, yeah, before we were even on iTunes.
That's right. Episode number 10. In which he almost single-handedly turned two real stinkers, or at least, 2 weak episodes into one of my favorite episodes of the podcast. Go back, if you haven't heard that first season, go back and listen to episode 10, Rock Throw, West Virginia.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. And, like I said at the time, if anytime you wanted me back, I would happily do that. And now here you are, a good chunk of the way through season 3, and here I am. So great. Thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Now, don't make it sound, Jeff, like we intentionally didn't call you back until the middle of season 3, because you requested this episode, or this pair of, well, it is one episode, but this full hour WKRP, this journey into Johnny Fever's deepest, darkest corners of his psyche.
This dream quest?
The dream quest of unknown fever. The fever dream quest of unknown
Cincinnati.
Yeah, seeking out the holy grail of affirmation from his peers.
Like Mike says, Jeff, you specifically requested this episode.
I did, yes.
And it is a Lollapalooza. Do you want to say why this one in particular spoke to you?
Well, when I was watching it for the first time, I was alternately stunned, shocked, confused, frightened. I was listening back to the previous episode of this that I recorded with y'all, and there was at one point I did accuse Mike of being kind of disingenuous when he complained about how uncanny episodes of WKRP in Cincinnati tended to be. And I think, though, that there is a certain amount of uncanniness or kind of Lynchian quality to this episode that really, I'm not going to say it spoke to me, but it definitely seemed to be kind of out of place in the greater WKRP milieu in a way that I thought was interesting and worth examining.
So even more so than Hotel Ocean View, you would say this is a weirder with a capital W episode.
I would say that Hotel Ocean View is weird within the context of WKRP. It is a weird episode of WKRP in Cincinnati. By contrast, Dr. Fever and Mr. Tide is a weird episode of, Howard Hessman's Crazy Man Theater. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
Howdy, hi, guys and gals. for Gotta Dance. And we got a stack of wax from the beach for your feet. But first, a few words about Dr. Johnny Fever. Turns out the cat was a prima donna, so who needs him, huh? Right. Man was definitely stuck back in the 60s. And these are the 80s. So let's move with today. Let's move with the groove. Let's ride the tide. And that's me, Rip Tide. And I gotta dance. All right.
Well, we better talk about the episode.
Let's do it.
This episode, it's called Dr. Fever and Mr. Tide. Obviously a shout out to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because what happens in this episode is that Johnny has been asked to, or hired to, host a new sort of music dance TV show called Gotta Dance. But when he finds out that he is expected to play disco music, he tries to get out of it, but he can't. He's locked into the contract, so instead he invents a new alter ego named Rip Tide. And the show is immediately a hit, but Johnny begins to lose control of the Riptide persona, and it's not clear how much is in his head or how much of this is real, but basically the disco-loving Riptide and our classic rock-loving Johnny Fever are battling for control of Johnny Caravella, and it gets stranger from there.
Yeah, that's just the setup.
I mean, yeah, there's a sequence where Les is the voice of reason. That's how weird the show gets.
That's how weird this episode gets. Yeah, so what'd you guys think of Dr. Fever and Mr. Tide?
Well, I didn't really remember this one from childhood, since I'm a few years younger than you, and the episodes all kind of blend together in my head when I think back to watching it at that early age.
But you did watch it. Unlike our last guest, Mandy, the two of you are basically the same age, very close, but she never watched any of these 1970s sitcoms. And I told Mandy, Jeff watched WKRP. There's no reason you couldn't have. And she said, yeah, but Jeff is basically his own thing. He's like a old guy who time traveled from the 1920s, but also likes Rescue Rangers.
Yeah, well, she'll get hers.
I actually think that, that's a lovely descriptive phrase, and I'm sure accurate. I think if you were to travel to the 1990s from the 1920s, maybe Rescue Rangers would be something that, you would find comforting and you would grab onto.
That's true.
I suppose that's plausible to a certain extent. I mean, you would look at it and think, oh, little talking mice, I understand this, in a way that maybe Tiny Toons Adventures and Animaniacs and Freakazoid would not be things that you understood.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
You'd be like, oh, it's like that newfangled Mickey Mouse fellow that was in the cinemas before I left the 1920s.
Like the minstrel show with the talking mouse.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, God. Oh, dear. Well, anyway, so you don't remember this one from childhood, Jeff?
No, but I did watch it. Listening to the first episode of Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser inspired me to go out and get the Shout Factory's box set.
We're still waiting for that check, Shout Factory, by the way.
That's right, but everybody else, take note. That's what you should do. If you enjoy the podcast, rush out and watch every episode of WKRP.
I know I did, and my life is better for it. So
excellent.
I watched every episode, straight through over the course of, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks. Getting to this episode just baffled and confused me. Because for one thing, of the Shout Factory DVDs, they didn't specify in advance that this was an hour-long episode.
Right.
So watching it and watching it just slowly become more weird and kind of borderline surreal. And then I looked at the clock and I was like, it's already been on for 25 minutes. Surely something, there should be an ending, right? And instead it just kept going.
You're trapped in it. Yeah.
And this aired as an hour long. I mean, it wasn't aired as a two-parter over 2 weeks. Rob, I think you mentioned before we went on air, Rob, that this episode, the first half kind of dragged for you.
I think the first half is a little padded, and it's probably so that they can end on that great moment, which is the reveal of Riptide.
Yeah.
And Howard Hessman just going for it in this brand new character that we've never seen before.
And most of that padding takes the form of Johnny trying to back out of the contract, like you mentioned, the contract with this local TV person named Avis, played by Mary Fran. Johnny kind of seeing all the fringe benefits that this job will give him, including an open bar in his dressing room.
And a relationship with Mary Fran, too.
Well, that's the thing.
With Bob Newhart's second wife.
It's barely implied and basically explicit that Avis, Mary Fran's character, is providing Johnny with sexual favors in exchange for Johnny's service.
Yes.
Which is just...
Well, that's because she's basically...
It's because she's the devil.
She's a Mephistopheles figure, and she's getting him to sell his soul to the most sinister thing that the writers of WKRP could come up with in 1981, and that is
Xanadu.
Disco music, Xanadu.
I can't believe that I didn't notice the Faustian sort of aspect of this, because she is a redhead, first of all. Like, that should be a dead giveaway. And I think Riptide's first outfit is kind of devilish looking. There's like bright red sparkles and sequins and stuff, and it's... Yeah, wow.
It's a little bit like the sequence in Citizen Kane when the guy is singing the campaign song and everything is weirdly lit and the music is extremely excited and happy, and watching it you just have this sense of mounting dread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like Gotta Dance is shot in kind of the same kind of unwholesome.
It's one of the outer circles of Dante's Inferno or something, is the Gotta Dance set with all these kids dancing. So people listening might think now that we are doing what you accuse Mike of doing, which is being disingenuous about how creepy or weird this episode is. But I want to say that, okay, if the first half is slow moving, a little bit padded, the second half, it really does get strange. And the thing that is strange is, I mean, Howard Hessman obviously is having a ton of fun playing the two personas and switching back and forth sometimes, within one line of dialogue.
Yes.
At first it seems like it's just something he's doing, and then it is explicit that he can't control it, and that he is in fact losing control of his personality, that he's had some sort of we don't call this schizophrenia anymore, but that he's had some sort of a personality break.
Yeah, there's one line that I found really chilling. Where Johnny says that Riptide, he doesn't like Riptide. Riptide does not like the food that Johnny serves him.
Yeah. Yes.
But what he does like is young girls, really young girls.
Yeah.
Which, that's not funny. That's not a punchline.
That's not a punchline.
There's nothing funny about that.
That's one of the moments that really clearly evokes Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, but also the 70s and young girls. I know we're out of the 70s, but...
If you go on the assumption that Riptide is an amalgamation of every person that Johnny has ever hated in the music industry, that line makes a lot of sense. Like, if you go on the assumption that Johnny has been surrounded throughout the 70s by sleazy agents, sleazy managers, really, really badly behaving rock stars, every single part of that is smushed into this Riptide character. And doesn't Riptide, Rob, look a lot like Johnny's alter ego from the Daydreams episode?
Oh yeah, that's true. Sort of all flashy and satiny and sequins and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Tight trousers, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Girls hanging off of him.
The look of Riptide is a lot of the fun, but also some of the creepiness that
he's too old to be wearing those clothes.
He's too old to be wearing those clothes. Johnny dyes his hair, eyebrows, and mustache, but only what appears when he's wearing Riptide's hat. So there's a nice sort of angled slice. So everything from sort of, an inch above his ears down, because Riptide always wears some sort of sequined beanie or something.
Yeah, some beret. I put in the notes, that fucking hair dye, it's still funny 35 years later. But visually, throughout the entire episode, it's a marker. It's like the high water mark. It's like the Riptide mark.
It doesn't go away.
Exactly.
Riptide, that's right. Oh yeah, it makes me think of the... what's the Hunter Thompson quote from Fear and Loathing about you can see the 60s, you can see the high water mark at which
from Vegas, you could see it.
Which are sort of all our ideals crested and then sank away.
Yeah.
That's the line on Johnny's head.
Yeah, pretty much. But Jeff, do you agree that Riptide, if he constructed this persona, it had to be constructed from people Johnny knew?
I didn't get the impression that Riptide was Johnny deliberately creating a character that was everything that he hated.
Okay.
In the way that Jennifer's persona is self-created, that we talked about way back in episode 10.
Yeah.
I did not get that impression. I got really more the sense that Riptide was this thing that had always existed inside of Johnny, that he had woken up.
Wow.
That he had evoked. Or that Avis had evoked, the devil had evoked.
That's good, because think about, we've had other episodes where fame goes to Johnny's head.
Yes, we have.
And he turns into a jerk pretty quickly when someone gives him an award or offers him a new job in L.A. Mm-hmm. You know, it does turn his head.
Well, I think that's really a good point, Rob, because the other episode that this reminded me of, that Dr. Fever and Mr. Tide reminded me of, was God Talks to Johnny. Because it's the other episode where we've seen Johnny's sanity kind of teeter on the brink. I mean, Mike Fright, sure, but like God Talks to Johnny is the one where he's ready to institutionalize himself because he believes that these messages, he can't stop them and he can't stop thinking about them. But there, it's God, or at least he presumes it's God. And here, if we're gonna call Avis, you know, the Mephistopheles figure, it's the devil. So I don't even know where to go with this, but it's a recurring feature of Johnny's character that he's in touch with this liminal spirit world kind of side of things.
The sort of shamanic version of Johnny Fever, prone to acid flashbacks.
Oh, Johnny, I care about you. I don't want to see you ending up with nothing.
Well, listen, honey, I've been living on next to nothing for most of my life.
Well, listen, honey, you try living on a fourth of next to nothing for the rest of your life. Because it'll mean garnishment of your salary, and they will do it. Now, baby, don't be a fool. I have big plans for you in this show. And if you screw that up, they'll make you pay. Don't you think they won't?
Can't you just please find somebody else?
I don't want somebody else. I hired you, Johnny Fever, to get out there and smile and laugh and dance and shake your booty. Because that's what those kids expect, and my darling, that is exactly what you are going to give them.
Well, look at it in the context of the scene that gives rise to Riptide, right? Johnny has decided that he does not want to do this TV show.
Right.
Avis comes in, and first she plies him with booze and sex, and then threatens him with a lawsuit, and Venus is with him at the time, and Venus points out that Johnny doesn't have any money, and so a lawsuit is essentially an empty threat. And Avis changes tacks, and like her third thing is that a lot of people are going to suffer if Johnny doesn't carry out his contract and make this TV show, that there's a lot riding on it that affects more people than just Johnny.
Interesting.
And it's from that whole series of different ways that Mary Fran is putting pressure on him that Riptide comes out.
Yeah.
Right. He's trapped. It's a long scene, perhaps not entirely convincing how trapped he is, that he has no option but to do this show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just occurred to me on our Avis as Mephistopheles theme, Avis Rent-A-Car. The slogan of Avis in these days was, "We're number 2, we try harder." That's Mephistopheles, right? That's Lucifer. He's number 2. He has to try a little harder.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is that I liked also your mention of Venus being present, because Venus has to be the angel on his shoulder. He kind of has to be the guide to kind of remind him of, you know, Johnny doesn't need reminders about why he hates disco and why he doesn't want to dress up in these Riptide outfits at the beginning of the episode. But I think when it comes to the temptations that you're talking about, they don't really sink into Johnny. I think that's because Venus is there. Venus seems a little tempted himself. I mean, he's like, oh, I could probably see myself doing a TV show for a little extra money every week.
It's not a little extra money. The amount of money that they're offering him in like $2016 works out to like $75,000 a year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's good money.
It has to be a substantial increase to Johnny's paycheck.
Oh, yeah.
And it's obvious that it's going to grow, too. The show is catching on. It's a shame that Venus couldn't do it, because unless you believe that disco music is ineluctably, the work of the devil, which I think we'll get to later, Venus already dresses like that.
Yes.
He's got a lot of charisma.
Yep.
He could absolutely host a dance disco show.
He's done local TV before. He is Sailor Ned.
He has experience.
He was Samurai Ned.
Yeah.
Samurai Ned, right.
That's a great little detail. One more little, wrinkle in Venus's increasingly implausible backstory is that he was Sailor Ned, the host of a kiddie show, and he had a little dance. And am I crazy, or one of Riptide's more remarkable outfits is this jacket with the Silver Surfer on the back. It's like a black satiny jacket with the Silver Surfer on the back and these day glow rainbow stripes down the sleeves.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that Venus wore that jacket in an earlier episode. I don't think we saw the Silver Surfer because I would remember that.
No.
But those sleeves, I could have sworn I've seen them before on Venus.
It looks like the kind of thing Venus would wear, certainly.
Yeah. I think you're right, Rob, and I think that using the Silver Surfer, this may not have been intentional, but if we're going to go crazy with this overinterpretation, think about the Silver Surfer for a moment. He struck a Faustian bargain with Galactus to become the Herald, right? And to survive his planet being eaten. He just decided to be the lone survivor and to be Galactus's herald for the rest of his existence. And so that's and of course he eventually breaks free and becomes the Silver Surfer we know and love. But like, I may be taking that a little too far.
Wow, wheels within wheels.
It's an interesting parallel because unlike the devil, Galactus is beyond good and evil.
Oh.
Right? Galactus is simply part of the nature of the universe. The universe has Galactus in it.
Yes.
And nothing like Galactus has ever come before. Nothing like Galactus will ever come again. Galactus is? No. Now I'm thinking of Darkseid.
My nerd alarms are starting to go off.
But they're Darkseid and Galactus are two very different characters, and Darkseid is a lot more like the supernatural evil that I'm trying to bring this back around to WKRP.
Bring it home.
You don't have to. It's okay.
He's much more the supernatural evil that I think Avis represents, where there's a recurring thing in the comics where the superhero goes off, does some awesome thing, gets back home, and Darkseid is sitting there in his house,
yes,
where he's been waiting for him, drinking his wine. The idea that you can't keep Darkseid out, you can't keep the devil out as long as there is darkness in men's souls. So this will continue.
I like this, Jeff, because
anyway.
No, I want to finish this up, Rob, because Galactus, as you say, Jeff, correctly, he's a survivor of the previous universe, and so he is kind of a force of nature in this universe. And theologically, there is a tradition that says that God and the devil need to coexist. It's like the Gnostic sort of dualist sort of thing, and like, if Galactus is just a force of nature that's opposed to creation, and is a creation and destruction cycle, then, yeah, I mean, I think it's legitimate to look at Galactus as a devil figure, but more of a Gnostic one than a classically Christian sort of Dantean, Faustian sort of thing.
Right, because that places Galactus in contrast to Mary Fran.
Guys.
Because Mary Fran is all about the individual corruption of Johnny.
Yes, absolutely.
I love you guys. Can we get back to WKRP?
It's his fault, Rob. I wouldn't be doing this if you weren't here.
You invited me on knowing who I am, so...
That's true. That's a good point.
Good point.
See, if I understand my producer... What we have to get is a prime demographic in each of the top 10 markets.
And the secondaries will fall in line.
Yeah. Now, it's a rolling market strategy.
Right.
The rate card is based on the demographic slew.
Skew.
Skew, that's the word.
I knew it.
Yeah, our skew is heavy on teens, but if we can get the secondary and temporary... Tertiary 18 to 34s, we get a shot at the prime advertising dollar.
God, I love it.
Johnny.
Yeah.
Do you realize that you just used the word skew and the word tertiary?
Yes, I did. It wasn't me talking. That was Rip Tide. Am I right, Herb?
Oh, you're so right. I'm about to faint.
See, that's Rip talking. That's not the doctor. The doctor is still too cool to discuss this nonsense. What does she know, right?
Right.
What do you know, right?
Oh, right.
Right. I'll tell you what I know, though. I gotta dance.
Oh, me too.
Ciao, kids.
Yeah, it's really interesting how each different character responds to Riptide. Mm-hmm. I'm struck by, first of all, how quickly everyone except Herb is horrified by Riptide. Even in like the first 10 seconds, Bailey says puke, and they're like, oh my God, this is so awful.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, is it just overdetermined that disco is terrible, that everyone hates disco, or is it that maybe it's just they can't bear to see Johnny behaving in so out of character?
Well, I felt like for a chunk of the episode at least that there was this sort of dyad being set up of Bailey on one side and Avis on the other side.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw that.
You know, sort of like an A. Merritt story where you have the good woman and the bad woman battling for control of the man. It kind of falls apart in the scene where Bailey and Avis finally meet, and Avis just instantly crushes Bailey.
Well, I don't know if that falls apart or just that she is the victor.
Yeah.
The first thing that we see after that initial appearance of Riptide, when Johnny is talking to people, he's talking to specifically Herb and Bailey. And Herb, of course, loves Riptide, and Bailey does not like Riptide, and it bothers Johnny that Bailey dislikes Riptide so intensely. He's actively seeking her approval and buy-in in that scene.
Right. And it's a signal that Riptide is bad news, that he and Herb are so simpatico, and Johnny is already talking about market share and that sort of thing. That's a sign of the wickedness.
Yeah, and Herb is comparing him to Dick Clark, who, never ages because he sold his soul to the devil.
Oh, no.
Right.
When I was watching the episode again to prepare for this, I was really struck by the extent to which Johnny's journey really resembles that of like an Arthurian knight being tempted by the devil on their way to finding the Holy Grail. I sent you a link to the thing that I wrote about that.
Yeah, so that was from your excellent, and we should plug this again, your excellent summary of Thomas Mallory's Mort d'Arthur.
Arthur dies at the end, yeah.
Arthur dies at the end, available at Amazon.
Yeah, so this particular bit is in book 4, I think it's 4, Sir Galahad is Better Than You. And it's not actually about Sir Galahad, it's Sir Percival.
So it's Percival, so it's the Grail Knight, it's the Holy Fool, who we identified Johnny with way back when in the Fisher King episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, this episode becomes almost a direct sequel to Turkeys Away in that sense. In an occult Arthurian sense.
Yes.
Of the Grail Knights in Mallory, Percival is definitely the most holy fool of them. He's not down to earth the way Bors is, and he's not, just visibly blessed and using cheat codes the way Galahad is. And at one point in his quest, he bumps into a holy man who, as I recall, warns him that he was going to face a great temptation. And if he did not succeed in this temptation, he was definitely not going to get any limbs sliced off, which was an odd forewarning. But then immediately afterwards, he meets this beautiful woman who plies him with fortified wine and lots of different kinds of meat and the implicit offer of sex. And she talks about how she used to serve a really great lord, and then they had this disagreement. And now she roams the world seeking servants of the Great Lord and trying to make them her servants because she feels like the Great Lord isn't treating them well enough. Do you get it? Hint, hint, hint. And
what you're saying is that she is actually Bob Newhart's wife.
Exactly. You hit the nail right on the head, Rob.
I didn't believe this until I read the bit that you sent me, Jeff, about how she used bottles of wine, like you just mentioned. And isn't that exactly the first thing that we see about Johnny saying, yeah, we split about 5 bottles of this stuff last night?
Yeah, exactly. And, finally he's rejecting her through the power of his sword, which happens to be shaped like a cross, which is really handy for him. And in an attempt to cure himself of the temptation, he castrates himself, which is the defeating of the devil and the self-mutilation that was predicted, which is pretty grim and I was not expecting it the first time I was reading it. By contrast, when Bors goes through the same thing, he does not castrate himself. He just says, "No, thank you, Satan," and leaves.
Yeah, that.
I feel like Percival kind of felt kind of dumb
after
the week when he heard how Bors dealt with it.
I could have done that. Yeah. Oh, okay.
We want Riptide to come to work for us. Now, what do you think? Just take your time.
I don't like it.
Why?
I don't want him up here.
What are you talking about?
Guy is a creep, Herb.
Tide's you.
No, he's not.
But then who is he?
But he's a TV guy.
Well, he's a TV guy, John, that we could use here.
Doing what?
Well, how about the morning drive time?
Well, that's Fever's slot.
To hell with him.
What?
I'm sorry. I forgot who I was talking to.
Let me cut in here a second and say that's a bad idea. I don't want to replace Fever. Let's forget about that. I was suggesting maybe like a one-man team.
Huh?
You know, you and the Rip.
I work alone, Andy.
Yeah, but you would be working alone, John.
No, he wouldn't. It'd be, he and the Rip.
He is the Rip.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, so everybody in the station responds a little differently to Riptide and to Johnny as Riptide. Herb is really excited, both by the money it can make, but also, you get the sense that he's excited that he has a new friend, that Rip likes him.
Yeah.
Les, of course, is the first one to start talking about personality dissociative disorders, and he gives a little lecture. He says, I happen to be something of an expert. I like that Andy's like the rational guy in a horror movie who's not equipped to deal with it, because Andy, long after everyone else has accepted that there's two people here, Andy keeps insisting that Johnny and Riptide are the same person, right? And he's like, Johnny says, but I work alone. And he says, well, you would be working alone, which is true, of course. But, Andy's not equipped to deal with it because he's like Scully.
See, you have to embrace this kind of stuff, Rob. We got Jeff on this week. Just start making comparisons like that. You got to just embrace the mystery, as it were.
Sure.
I love the big guy's line because everybody's talking about how they're, speaking not only as themselves, but as the program director or as the sales manager. And the big guy goes, well, I'm speaking to you right now, John, as both myself and the general manager of the station. All 8 of us are in agreement.
That's right. So all their personalities are splintering by this point. Exactly.
That scene that we're talking about is one that, when I was seeing this episode for more or less the first time, is another one that really struck me as kind of odd. The thing is, Les is the voice of reason in that scene. He is the person who is saying what, at this point, is clear to the audience, that Riptide is bad news.
Right. Well, voice of reason in the same sense that Andy is the person in the horror movie who won't see what's going on, and Les is the one who, the crazy voice of reason, the person who jumps to the correct crazy conclusion.
Both of those people in horror movies usually do get killed. So just so we know,
Sure.
That sometimes is the fate that those folks have.
Well, I think Les leaves the scene before Johnny comes in, and I don't know that we see Les for the rest of the episode, so maybe he dies. Maybe Rip kills him off screen.
Yeah, he's begun stomping people to death, just like Mr. Hyde.
With platform disco shoes.
I know what you're doing. You're just toying with me. It's all right. I'm used to it. I can take it, and I can dish it out. I like your style, Jennifer. I do. I'm crazy about you, baby. Yum, yum, yum.
But I don't like you.
Hey, it's really just me, we all have a lot of different faces, and I just found this schlemiel inside who's really fighting to get out, that's all.
Rip?
Yeah, it's just a constant battle for control, It just goes back and forth and back and forth and
Johnny?
back. And, yeah, you know him. The guy's a lameoid. He's not going anywhere. He's got no direction in his life.
I like him.
Oh, come on, really?
He's my friend.
Don't jibe me, honey.
And I will not have my friends talked about that way.
Well, you never really liked him.
Yes, I really liked him.
And then when I think things have gone just about as far as they can go, there's a big scene where Johnny talks to Jennifer. And this is where we really see Johnny not in control of his two personas.
Yeah.
And where he even, he talks about how he hates Rip, and then Rip talks about how he hates Johnny. At this point, we are well into Crazy Town. What did you think of this scene?
Well, going into this scene, it came immediately after the troubling scene in Carlson's office. And I thought to myself, okay, here it is. This is going to be the resolution. Jennifer is going to talk some sense into him. Jennifer will set him straight. If there's any character on WKRP who has the superpower of talking sense into people, it's Jennifer.
It's true.
Yeah.
And yet that's not really what happens. Jennifer kind of meets her match in Riptide, and eventually she throws up her hands and kind of walks away, and she's done her best. She's done all she can do.
Is this a scene where Sympathy for the Devil is playing?
Sympathy for the Devil plays when Andy first comes back into the office.
Oh, okay.
So, but it is in the lobby.
They make a big deal about how Andy was absent in the first half of the two-parter, or the first half of the hour, which is an odd thing to keep harping on.
Yeah.
Right. That seems like a Chekhov's gun thing. We're going to find out that Andy is the killer. What I was going to say about the scene with Jennifer, you're right. You're totally right, Jeff, that, yeah, it ends kind of on a down note, that Jennifer, tries to reach out to Johnny personally, even though she speaks of him in the third person. I liked Johnny, she says, or I like Johnny. I don't know if it's past tense.
It is past tense. I remember clearly.
It's past tense, so it's very down and sad. Yeah, I guess Jennifer is the one with the superpower of talking sense into people. I kind of wish it was Bailey. I feel like Venus and Bailey are trying to help Johnny in this episode, and there's no scene at the end where Johnny apologizes to them or where they help pull him back or anything like that.
Well, it's weird because after Jennifer gives up and leaves and we're left with Johnny/Rip standing there looking thoughtful, Venus and Bailey do come in, right? And again, seeing the episode for more or less the first time, I thought, okay, so this is where it's going to be. This is where Venus and Bailey are going to finally break through to him now that he's on the rocks from Jennifer. And what happens instead is that they just they barely look at Johnny. They just sort of glance his way, wave, and then they leave.
Yeah.
And he's left alone.
Yeah, they're letting him go.
They don't try again to reach out to him, which really surprised me.
Yeah.
This episode does defy the usual sitcom, have a problem happen, everybody kind of pulls together like a family. You're right. Johnny/Rip is kind of completely alone by the end of this episode, and he has to make the decision himself. He has to make it through this problematic time in his life completely alone without the support of anyone. That's really interesting.
Well, if it is some kind of, psychic journey, fever dream thing, Grant Morrison's Batman R.I.P.
Fever dream. That's great. That's great.
Then, yeah, in the end, he does have to face it alone, I guess. That's the moral.
Yeah.
I like what Jennifer's wearing in that scene. She looks like a baby chick.
She's all in yellow, lemon yellow, yeah.
She's all yellow and fuzzy.
Can't pin this episode down. It's a sitcom. It's by its nature, it's a little bit unrealistic. I'm having a lot of trouble kind of pinning down, if Johnny is thoroughly not in control, how can we even end the episode thinking that he's better? You know what I mean? Just because he happened to make the decision on stage at Gotta Dance in the final scene to repudiate disco and, play some old time rock and roll for the kids. I mean, do we trust that as is he better? Is Riptide gone forever? I mean, what do we think about that?
It does seem kind of hard to buy that Johnny can so easily come back from where he is in the next to last scene, or next to last scene. But and yet that's what we're shown.
Oh, wouldn't that have been a great final bit if the episode ended just as we saw, and then he comes back to the station and he does have a sort of rapprochement apology to Bailey and Venus, and everyone feels all good, and then the end shot, it's like Bob in Twin Peaks. Suddenly he turns to the camera and he's Rip.
How's Bailey?
And you would believe that Howard Hesseman would be able to convey that without the costume, without the hair dye, just with like the look on his eyes, because Johnny and Rip look different, like even not having to do with the costuming.
Yeah, I mean, let's give a shout out to Howard Hesseman. This was obviously a fun episode for him to do, one that he could really sink his teeth into and do these roles. Because, there are times where that uncanniness comes from his own just switching gears and doing the two parts.
Yeah.
It reminds me that we've mentioned this before, but originally Howard Hesseman was supposed to play or was brought into audition to be Herb Tarlick, to be the salesman. And, he can do smarmy.
I'm wondering if this is how he did his line reads for Herb in his audition. Because again, we've talked about the fact that Herb and Rip seem to be completely on the same level. And I think that if he had done Herb like that, it would have been a bit much, like every episode.
Oh, yeah. No, he's really over the top.
Yeah.
Here. Talking about curing him, this whole plotline reminds me of another sitcom from this era, which is Taxi. And on Taxi, in the later seasons of Taxi, Latka, Andy Kaufman's character, began to develop multiple personalities.
Yeah.
Perhaps in a similar way to, of course, Andy Kaufman himself had multiple personalities. And I think that they let him do this on Taxi largely because he was getting bored. And so he became this guy, Vic Ferrari. He was this British guy. He became the Jeff Conway character also. And he had more and more multiple personalities. And eventually, maybe it went too far, because eventually he was cured by who? Dr. Joyce Brothers. If a sitcom character goes insane in the early 1980s, who's going to cure them? Vicky Von Vicky.
So she was playing herself in that episode. I don't remember
playing
that
herself.
one.
Yeah, she came on and cured her.
That's fantastic. Oh my God. She brought her own mic. So,
I'm awfully sorry about this, boys and girls, but the old Ripper just looked at his little ledger here, and this record does not have what it takes to be played on the show, okay? Hey! I'm pretty darn choked up about it myself, kids. Bear with me for a moment. Now, the thing is, you all know that a record's gotta have three things for me to put it on a turntable, huh? It's gotta have a beat, right? Right! And it's gotta have soul, right? Right! And it's gotta be paid for, right? Well, so if any of you want to get in the record business, you just slip the old Rip a cashier's check in his pocket, and guess what? We're in business, okay? Wake up, boys and girls. You don't think the old Ripper plays this because he likes it, do you? Oh, what about you, dear? Do you really like this droid synth music better than real-life rock and roll?
So I mentioned a little earlier the final scene and how that unfolds is that Johnny / Rip, I have to use that nomenclature at this point, but he's starting to break down and he is trying every single thing he can do to get fired, essentially. So he starts hitting on the underage members of the crowd of Gotta Dance. He starts talking about how he accepted payola to spin records, and the one that was on the turntable at the time, didn't pay, so they don't get to get played. And so he's doing all of these things to try and disrupt and, again, get himself out of the contract. But in the end, Johnny comes back, he returns, and he wants to get these kids dancing to something that's not disco.
Yeah, so he pulls back the curtain on all the corruptions of the music industry, and basically, I didn't like this part. He turns into Stan Freberg at the end, sort of, saying the only reason these songs could possibly be hits is payola, which of course was exactly the charge leveled at songs like Little Richard, at rock and roll when it came out.
Yeah.
But then he harangues the kids, they harangue him, and then he puts on a Little Richard album. And the moment I love, of course, and this is a big moment for the audience. Everyone cheers because Johnny is back and because he's trash talking disco, which is always beloved by the audience of the show. And the specific moment I love is that he puts the Little Richard record on, and there's one kid in the foreground who sort of listens to the music plays for about a second. And the kid kind of like, there's a moment and then he nods judiciously, like he's listened to it enough and he's decided, yeah, you can dance to this. And all the kids start dancing. And I just want to like, shout out to the teenager nodding judiciously, just deciding that little Richard is okay with him.
A great acting choice made by that extra.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's so like 1980s, like Footloose kind of like, yeah, it's cheesy, but you're right. It's perfect for, what they're trying to do here. But this is what we've been waiting to talk about, Rob, for 2.5 seasons of Hold My Order. Disco versus rock.
Disco versus rock.
The disco sucks conversation, yeah.
This is why you set up the podcast in the first place, was to talk about this. I feel impressed and honored that I get to be here at the ground floor to listen in. As which of you is pro-disco and which of you is anti-disco?
Well, this is, I mean, that's a great question, Jeff, because this is kind of where we've lampshaded it a lot, that we have differing musical tastes when it comes to the music of the KRP era. But here's the thing, by 1981, and it's even called out expressly in the first half of the episode, disco is dead. I mean, Johnny says it, he's like, why are they doing a disco show? Disco is dead.
Yeah, Jamie Weinman on his blog talks about how this is an example just of how shows have to move fast if they want to be topical.
Yeah.
If this episode had come out even just a year before, disco and the anti-disco backlash in sort of 79, 80 were very big and very topical.
I mean, it's in Airplane, for God's sake. It was the line that got the biggest laugh, is when the titular airplane crashes into the disco station's antenna, and the guy is on the air saying, "Welcome to WZAZ, where disco lives forever." And then it crashes, and then the crowd, apparently the Abrams and Zucker team, said that line got the loudest laugh of any line in the entire movie in 1980. So,
yeah,
it's on people's minds.
Yeah, but by 1981, people were saying disco is dead.
Yeah.
And so they had to like work around that a little bit. Now, from the distance of 35 years, it works fine because we can't remember exactly when disco was alive or dead. And, of course, reports of its death were, I'm sure, highly exaggerated.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Disco sucks! Disco sucks! Disco sucks!
July 12th, 1979. A twilight doubleheader at Comiskey Park. The White Sox versus the Tigers. Between games, 24-year-old Steve Dahl, a popular disc jockey for Chicago rock station Loop 98, would take the field at the head of his so-called anti-disco army to blow up thousands of disco records.
Every day I would play a disco record and drag the needle across it, and scratch it and then blow it up. But I tapped into something. There's an undercurrent of hatred for disco.
In a few minutes, we're going to attempt the world's largest disco demolition.
We know it now in the 2010s as, oh, disco sucks. But like at the root of it was all of this stuff about race and gender and sexuality and orientation.
Right, but that surface level is the only part of it that I ever engaged with. I never heard about disco as being something that black people were into, that gay people were into, that women were into, compared to your straight white guys who were into rock. I never heard about that until just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, I think that disco has been kind of reevaluated by people, and that at this time, in 1980, 1981, you couldn't heap too much derision on disco, that everybody joined in their condemnation of this music. And it's easy now, I think, to see the racism and homophobia that the sort of disco sucks campaign licensed.
Yeah.
But I do think that a lot of people at the time probably thought they were acting out a different script about music becoming too phony and too commercial. And that's really what sort of the note that WKRP keeps hitting here, right? Is that...
Yeah.
I mean, nobody ever talked about fake music girls the way people talked about fake geek girls. And by people, I mean guys online. Right?
Well, I think it's the same impulse, though, Jeff. You brought up that article that came out during Gamergate that Arthur Chu wrote.
Oh, yeah. Well, he's... Arthur Chu is the guy who was on Jeopardy a few times. I don't know that much about him beyond that. But he wrote this article during Gamergate a couple of years ago where he drew a parallel between the fake geek girl Gamergate backlash, I guess, and the the attack on disco by rock and roll.
Yeah.
Saying that, to call Led Zeppelin oppressed compared to the Bee Gees is like calling Call of Duty players oppressed compared to people who are playing text adventures about depression.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and he calls out Disco Demolition Night
Yeah.
in that article as kind of that moment, like Gamergate, where it entered the popular sort of awareness, Did we know that rock and roll, long-haired rock and roll fans were this angry about disco before, 5-cent beers were offered to the crowd at Comiskey Park and Steve Dahl blew up a bunch of disco LPs? I mean, that was the sort of moment where it entered the popular consciousness, I guess.
Yeah, Mike's talking about, it was called Disco Demolition Night. Sometimes people call it the day disco died, which was like an actual anti-disco rally at Comiskey Park. Some of the background to that is that about 6 months before this, the progressive rock FM station in Chicago, WDAI, had suddenly switched to an all disco format. So, sort of disenfranchising all of these rock fans and in their minds following the money, because disco was a phenomenon at this time, a big financial phenomenon. Add to that the sort of sense that people had that disco was kind of mechanical, robotic, that they just cared about manufacturing hits. And you have the basis for this really deep hostility. But you can't whitewash out of it the sort of race, gender, homophobia stuff. Just, the ubiquity of that line, disco sucks. It actually was, we had our moms on recently. And as a kid, I wasn't big with profanity. I didn't swear a lot. Certainly not around my mother. I didn't swear a lot.
Your dad didn't call Mr. Rogers a shithead in front of you, for certain.
He might have, but the one thing I remember is that we clearly had different ideas about how offensive a word sucks was.
Yeah.
Because to me, it was just sort of a generic statement of something being bad. But if I said something sucks in front of her, I think that to her, that word only meant it was a sort of homophobic reference to oral sex. And it only meant that. And it was both gross and homophobic. And so she always reacted strongly if I remarked that disco or anything else sucked. And I might well have remarked that disco sucks because, in terms of the music that I listened to then and that I continue to listen to, I am Team Johnny. I am, dad rock, and I probably always will be. I like the music that Johnny likes, and I like the music since then that sounds like that music that calls back to that.
Yeah.
But
let me give you the counterpoint, Rob, because when I listened to the songs in this episode, like Xanadu, like I Love the Nightlife, these just brought me right back to childhood.
Yes.
I think it's even called out, he looks at the records that he's going to have to play. He says, Barry Manilow, Barry Gibb, Barry White. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that was on the radio when I was, again, 4, 5, 6 years old. We've already talked about my childhood love of Barry Manilow. All of this stuff that was, again, sort of looked at as disposable pop stuff. It's the stuff I remember.
It's lasted. Absolutely. I'm actually on your side in this. I think that I was reading a thing about Chic, the group Chic, the disco group Chic, Le Freak.
Sure.
And
the song is in this episode. We just don't have it on the DVD.
That's right. And they have sort of famously been nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 10 times and never admitted.
Yeah.
And, maybe they never will be because the people who vote people into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame are 70-year-old versions of Johnny, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Classic rock people. But, if you look at that Johnny Riptide divide, if you look at the music and you say, okay, 35 years ago, you have guitar-driven rock for white male audiences on the one hand, and then you have beat-oriented dance music for teens of both genders and all races. And then you look at the next 35 years, look at hip-hop, rap, electronic music, techno. Where has there been more development and more creativity? Which genre has kept innovating for 30 years, and which genre is holding on to the past?
Yeah, I mean, that gets me thinking of all kinds of stuff like the Sasha Farrer Jones article about indie rock and how white it's become. I start thinking about Chic and Nile Rodgers. Nile Rodgers went on to work with David Bowie in Let's Dance and inspired basically the entirety of that Daft Punk album from a few years ago, Random Access Memories. I mean, the influence is undeniable. I mean, more music today owes a debt to disco than to classic rock and roll. Definitely. Absolutely.
Well, some number of episodes ago, I forget exactly when, y'all talked about American masculinity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the big takeaway from that was the idea that at least American masculinity is experienced in crisis.
Yes.
That it is something that only exists within the context of being under attack. And, you look at John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, and I mean, when I was a kid, that was gay. That was so gay.
Yeah.
That was not something that you wanted to be associated with. And looking back on it, I guess the reason that it was so gay was that girls were into it.
Yeah.
Which is... It's so bizarre to think about it in those terms. It's like people complaining, and by people I mean at this point teenage boys, complaining that Justin Bieber is gay because girls are into him.
Yeah.
And when you think about Tony Manero, he's the most macho, overly, campily macho character in probably all of, the last 40 years of American motion pictures. And John Travolta, of course, that gets us into a whole other set of, rumors and innuendo.
Well, somehow hair metal comes down on the right side of masculine versus not masculine, and I don't know how that happened.
Because of who it's marketed to. Well, let me, if you guys will indulge me, the book that I read about a year ago and that really colors my thinking on this and maybe turned me around on the disco question. We're going to have this whole discussion, and then tonight I'm going to listen to White Stripes or Drive-By Truckers. I'm still in the guitar rock for white dudes demographic. Nevertheless, the book is by Elijah Wald. I've mentioned it before. It's called How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll. And it's a great history of popular music before rock and roll, really. The title's a bit misleading. But when you get to the final chapters, try and make a long story medium short. In the 60s, this extremely creative and productive period for what was rock and roll music, what was becoming rock music. Groups like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, made rock and roll music far more sophisticated, right? And they sort of were able to make a case that rock could be high culture. But they also made it more white.
Yeah.
Not intentionally, but as rock became more serious, as it was the voice of a counterculture, its fans and creators wanted to distance themselves from the sort of blatantly commercial dance hits for teeny boppers mentality that in the early days, in the days of Little Richard and Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins, all rockers took for granted, right? But, by the 60s, rock fans, people like Johnny Fever, didn't want rock music to be commercial, and they didn't want it to chase the teeny boppers on the dance floor. And as they made this shift, a divide opened up. They kind of resegregated popular music, not intentionally, but the Motown groups, Smokey Robinson, Temptations, those kind of groups that were still around then, they were still focused on getting hits on AM radio and dance beats. And Wald says, from the 40s through the 60s, white rock and roll styles and black rock and roll styles had evolved pretty much in tandem. But in the 1960s, they start to come apart. And let me read you a quote. He says, the Beatles and their peers had made rock into the most popular concert and album category of their time, and in the process expanded the style beyond anything its previous practitioners had imagined. In the process, though, they had led their audience off the dance floor, separating rock from its rhythmic and cultural roots. And while the gains may have balanced the losses in both economic and artistic terms, that change split American popular music in two.
Yeah.
And, when rock music became something for white males instead of something for girls and guys of both races who wanted to dance, something changed. There's even, Avis tells Johnny, she's like, yeah, I love the Grateful Dead too, Johnny, but you can't dance to it.
Which is weird because all I can picture when I think of the Grateful Dead is hippie girls in long skirts twirling around, but that's beside the point.
Yeah, you can find a way to dance to it. And we linked a little while ago to a nice article about the Rolling Stones and race.
Yeah.
And, this segregation was not done maliciously, but they were chasing different things.
Yeah, and I would argue that culturally and sort of artistically, all that stuff that you say from the Elijah Wald book is true. But there's also the money men. You know what I mean? There's the marketing angle to it, which is kind of appropriate given the Riptide discussion that we've had. And the idea that if this sort of separation between rock and R&B happens in the mid-60s, all of a sudden you can very, very accurately target which audience you want to go to. Now, record companies had, both types of labels, and obviously Motown was black owned and operated, so, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But the idea is that if you know what your audience is, you can market records, live performances, memorabilia, all that stuff to, a white suburban audience and not have to worry about that whole, what was that thing that Pete did on Mad Men where he wanted to start marketing to black consumers, and Sterling Cooper didn't let him do it. I think that there's a top-down thing happening here too, in terms of record labels and other people with the money kind of trying to get the more affluent white audience to buy into the culture.
Well, and the way you sell the music changes. So the economics of progressive 70s rock and roll was that
you market the album, not the single.
Is that you would sell albums, and maybe you put a hit single on the album, but that will carry over and you'll sell albums. And disco, of course, remained relentlessly about the single and getting the single into the discos. And
they might have been 12-inch singles, but they were still just like one long dance remix, basically.
And so that's two economic models that reach two different audiences and two different kinds of people.
Yeah, I have been just sagely nodding my head this whole time. So that's my contribution.
That's good.
It's okay, Jeff. Like I said, this is one we've been waiting to unleash for a long time. But it's come up so much again and again, Rob. It ties into the love and theft conversation we've had. I've talked about this on my other podcast, The Whole Shebang, about how the single was marketed to the teenage girl in the early 70s, and the album, as you say, was a Yes album or a Neil Young album. Those were very much marketed towards a Cameron Crowe type and Almost Famous. You know what I mean? Like a suburban white kid with belief that rock and roll was this exalted sort of format and this exalted sort of type of music.
So I think it's interesting and maybe telling in all of this that, so first of all, this episode locates, uses disco as a symbol of all sorts of things that are wrong with the music industry, and sort of it represents commercialism and phoniness to Johnny.
Yeah, disco is payola.
It's payola, exactly. It's payola, and there's no mention of payola in the first half of the episode. Yeah. I guess Ava says you have to play what we tell you to play,
right?
But then when Johnny is destroying or vanquishing Rip, that's what he says. He says, this is all payola. So he makes this argument, as I said, this sort of Stan Freberg argument that 20 years earlier is exactly what people were saying about rock and roll. That, there's no way the kids would listen to this if Alan Freed and Dick Clark weren't taking payoffs. And then he puts on an album from exactly that era.
Yeah.
And he puts on an album by an African-American musician that was absolutely written to get kids up on the dance floor and dance. He doesn't put on the Grateful Dead. He doesn't put on some Yes prog rock album. He doesn't put on Dark Side of the Moon. Which is a challenge to dance to.
No, really?
And so, and this also speaks to, there's this way in which at exactly the moment when rock was becoming white is also when it, became very solicitous of its black roots, right? So the kind of Rolling Stone rock, and I mean both the magazine and the band, is always very solicitous of giving props to Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf, even as they aren't interested in what James Brown is up to at the same moment.
Or P-Funk, or exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Soul Train, the hippest trip in America. 60 non-stop minutes across the tracks of your mind into the exciting world of soul with guest stars Lou Rawls, LTD, and the Soul Train Dancers. Brought to you in part by Johnson Products Company, makers of Ultra Sheen, Afro Sheen, and Ultra Sheen Cosmetics. And now, here's your host, Don Cornelius.
Hey there, and welcome aboard. You're right on time for another slick ride on the Soul Train. Be coming right back at you with a great sound by the incredible Stevie Wonder right after these very important communications.
The title of the show that Johnny's on is kind of perfect. It's an imperative. You gotta dance. And they riff on that a couple of times, that gotta dance is actually means you gotta play ball.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I liked the set of Gotta Dance because it reminded me of those great early 80s shows like Dance Fever and Solid Gold.
Solid Gold, yeah.
Which I watched, again, religiously. And these were in the post-disco era. I think Dance Fever started in the 70s, but I remember watching it in the 80s with Danny Terrio, and you'd have amateurs get up there and dance. I mean, Soul Train. Soul Train is, a cultural touchstone, not just for African-American culture, but for everyone. It was, again, on every weekend, and the kids got up and danced to the music. I mean, and it goes back to American Bandstand. And just like was mentioned in the episode about Dick Clark, I mean, this is a long tradition. The local dance show, the kids get up there, they get to be on TV, and they get to dance. And, again, like at this point in history, there's a lot of these type of shows on TV. Some of them appealing to the amateur, some of them just, the Solid Gold dancers just basically, danced to the hits of the day. So there were a few rock singles that they had to kind of feebly try to make out dance routines to, But yeah, I mean, this is a popular format. It was one of the biggest syndicated TV type shows out there. American Bandstand went on right through the 90s. And then, of course, in the 90s, MTV took over with, Dance MTV and sort of like all of these other sort of, disco type shows basically in the 80s and 90s.
I think that what that points to is that you can mislead yourself by paying too much attention to the exact labels and someone asserting that, disco starts in 1978 and disco is dead by 1981. That like teenagers have always wanted to dance, and there is a kind of a river that flows through all of this stuff, that flows through American Bandstand, Soul Train, the disco moment, and just keeps right on flowing into Solid Gold and MTV and on down the line.
Mm-hmm. I never watched those shows when I was a kid. They were one of those things that I looked at and saw as for people who were cooler than me. Right? Like I was never into Transformers. I was into GoBots, not because I thought that GoBots were cool, but because I thought Transformers were cool and I was not cool.
Oh, that's there's so many things that we deny ourselves, because we don't think we're allowed to like them. When in fact, the bar of how cool you have to be in order to watch Solid Gold was not really that high.
No, but it was higher than I thought that I was able to hurdle at the time.
I feel bad. I wish that, I want to go back and tell young Jeff to play with Transformers and watch Solid Gold.
It's okay. I can read X-Men comics. Nobody's going to make fun of me for reading X-Men comics.
That's kind of like at my high school, for some weird reason, reason's not that mysterious. The sort of the popular kids, the jocks, the basketball team, they were all the Deadheads. They were all the ones that listened to the Grateful Dead.
Whoa.
And the mysterious reason is that they also, smoked pot.
Yeah.
And
that's a twist ending. You're giving it away.
But it wasn't until I got to university that I learned that you didn't have to be a popular jock to listen to the Grateful Dead.
That's so weird. That is so weird. I mean, I think with me in high school, early 90s, the well-dressed Z Cavaricci gold chain-wearing kids at my prominently Italian Catholic high school, they were all into pop, dance, and rap.
Right.
And so there were a bunch of us that were like the more traditional long hairs who at that point were into grunge, metal, and that kind of stuff. That's a more traditional sort of, stratification of high school sort of musical taste. The popular Deadheads, though, that's very Canadian, Rob. That seems like a Degrassi plot to me. I don't know.
Could be.
Jeff, what did the popular kids listen to at your science and math high school in Arkansas?
I have no idea. I mean, I literally have no idea. It could have been... No, I don't know.
Well, do you have the latest Pixies album?
Yeah, but it sucks. All that new stuff sucks, but it's over there.
Actually, I was thinking of getting into something vintage anyway. I don't know, maybe the Doors?
Really? Never had you figured for a Doors fan.
I'm not really a Doors fan, but sure, I'd like to get into them.
No, my friend. Doors fans aren't made. They're born. I think right now in Africa, there's some guy madly beating on a drum. He's a Doors fan. Or an old lady on the bus sucking humbugs. She's a rider on the storm, but she ain't never heard the sounds. So what about you?
Well, I heard a record of theirs last night at a party.
Yeah?
And I've always liked Lover Madly.
Well, if you become a Doors fan, Lover Madly is the only song you won't like.
All right. I guess I should start with their greatest hits.
Hey! Greatest hits albums are for housewives and little girls. You're not serious. You don't want to be a Doors fan. Get out of my store.
Well, we should say goodbye to Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for doing the show again, Jeff. That was terrific.
I hope that it works out okay, and you do the same thing you did with episode 10 and just edit out all of the parts where I'm saying something stupid. I sounded so smart in that episode. I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, it's always a great pleasure to edit your stuff because, you know, no, it is. It is because...
It's a great pleasure to delete things that you say.
No, not delete, but the thing is, Jeff, we don't need to edit that much with you. You start somewhere and end somewhere, and that journey that you take us on, that's where the money is. That's where the value is. So thank you for being somebody who's willing to take a maybe circuitous trip somewhere and take us along for the ride. I really appreciate it.
Well, again, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back again soon with more WKRP riffs and memories. If you like this enough to listen to the whole thing, tell somebody about it.
You can find us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Facebook and Twitter, and at holdmyorderterribledresser.com, which wasn't taken. We always appreciate your clicks, your stars, your reviews, your comments, your tweets, your emails. Don't be strangers.
Good day, and may the good news be yours.
Baby, if you've ever wondered whatever became of me, I'm living on the air in Cincinnati, WKRP. I'm at WKRP in Cincinnati.
Okay. I should listen to the whole shebang. I haven't listened to it not because of a disinterest. I just haven't gotten around to it. It's not like I listened to one episode and was like, this is no good. So I'll listen to it at some point. And my dog is here, so I guess I'm going to stop recording.